Hello, guys. David Vose again. Another kind of pretty day, but it's kind of cloud, been windy, and the temperatures are going down just a tad. They're claiming we're going to get some weather. Hope you're having a beautiful day. Yesterday, as you know, we did a video on Jehovah's Witnesses and their history, Charles Taze Russell, and all the kind of crazy things that was going on. But we tied it into world events. We talked about Donald Trump, and we've delved into what a Templar was, a Knights Templar, which you'll never hear anywhere else in the world anybody explaining to you what all of these things do and where they came from and stuff, because they don't know. The only people that knows this information are the very people at the very top, and you have to ask yourself, how could they have hidden this from the entire world? How is it that people in China and Russia go to court and there's a guy in a black robe slamming down a gavel and throwing them into the gulag or the prison or whatever? And they don't think, wait a minute, how come we're doing the exact same things that they're doing in America? How come we have the same financial institutions? We're watching the same stuff on television. Why would, the same basic kind of things, sitcoms and series and movies and propaganda and drama? Why does it happen that Japan, China creates the little intricate parts of our computers and our moon landing equipment, which they all pretended to believe in, even though it was a childish B-rated movie? But yet China just said, oh yeah, we believe in it, and they started their own little childish propaganda. Had anybody ever told you that the immigrants that were coming over to America coincided with the exact moment that somebody, the Catholic Church, the Jesuit priests, the inquisitors, were literally driving the people out of France? And then another Inquisition in Spain and driving them out of that area. They leave from Plymouth Rock, go to the Isle of Man, the Scottish Rite, come to America. This had to have been hundreds of years before we're ever told. Because remember, they drove them out beginning in 1100 and something, in 1200. They started fleeing. And they had boats. Remember Joseph of Arimathea that had a boat that had 10 mines all around the world, one of which was in England, Britain, and different places like in Peru? They knew all about America. But when the original people that were fleeing, that were the real Knights of St. John, and this is why they talk about John the Prespyter, that was somewhere on the other end of the world, and they had built a New Jerusalem. And this was the story. They were coming to America to find it. They kept coming here to find it. Well, the ones that found it never left. They came here and they were told, shh, shh, shh. They're trying to massacre us, murder us, and kill us. So don't tell anybody that we're here. Anybody that got across the ocean on a boat and arrived in the New World just mingled amongst those living in peace. Probably from about 1200, because that's when they drove them out. And then they came in waves. But there's other immigration that started after 1776. Not far after that. You know about when they came over, because that's when they brought their banks and the birth certificates and the civil wars and the revolutions. And then they pretended that all of a sudden this free country was now under a jurisdiction of the court. What court? The court of a temple, which was built by the Templars in London. And now we're all under this gavel, and we're under their law everywhere in the world. I guess that is the church itself that they built. Or that is, if you see, that's actually part of the church. You can see the tower on the back end, the little tip of it. So that is part of what they built, but that's called the church, I think. But it's surrounded by all these other various courts and temples. And you go into the inner temples and so forth. So there's all kinds of buildings there. There appears to be what they say is the new temple environs. In 1200, they had it all drawn out. It's basically the whole downtown London. They control everything. So I don't know which of these buildings is part of what the Templars built, but it's all, some older pictures here, but this is all pretty much, I guess, part of it. This big, huge cathedral-like structures. Not sure, but I think the Mormons beat them, made them look like little tiny buildings. The Mormon temple over here in America looks pretty gothic. Yeah, that's where their headquarters is now, under the Mormon branch in Salt Lake. But this is what they were trying to do, is exceed the greatness of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar, but they couldn't do that. AI says the Middle Temple in London is a historic complex that was once home to the Knights Templar. That's their home. The temple church, built by the Knights Templar. So our entire world's run by a temple, and they call it a church. Yeah, no church and state here. It's located in the inner and the middle temples. So there's all kinds of temples, and then they got an inner temple and whatever. The Middle Temple is one of the four inns of the court in London. It's located in central London and is a peaceful oasis. The Temple Church is a royal peculiar in the Church of England. It's located between Fleet Street and the River Thames. The Knights Templar built the Temple Church as their English headquarters in the Temple Precinct. Pope Clement V disbanded the Knights Templars in 1312. The order's sudden disappearance led to speculation and legends that have kept the Templar name alive. Today, the Knights Templar organization fundraisers, support youth groups, and raise money for medical research and education. But there's the inside of that church, and that's just this one building they call the church, but it's a big complex. So now ask yourself this question. Why did Genghis Khan go all the way to Japan and take over Persia and China? Because this was the same people that were trying to colonize the world. But his movement went to Japan, and possibly it took them another 100, 200 years. They finally, some of them, sailed their boat along the coastlands and up through the Aleutian Islands into Alaska and found their way to Canada and America that way. There were migrations, but that took hundreds of years. That wasn't the main route for people coming over. But if you notice that at some point in the past, all the world was of one color or type. If you look in Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia, all the coastlands, the peoples in South America and here in America and Canada, and all the original indigenous peoples were all of a dark hair, light brown skin. There was another group of people that seemed to be these tall white individuals in the Swedish area, and they were called the barbarians by the Romans, by Julius Caesar, before the Flavians took over, of course. And they had long history of war with them. They finally took over the Catholic Church in 400, and they sent their little missionaries over to Japan and Persia and Iraq and conquered all that area for their world empire. The guys they were trying to root out of there were just trying to get away and find a place that was safe. On the other end of the globe, right, there was John's New Jerusalem and the New Kingdom. John meaning the original John, the original knight, and all of the Knights of St. John that went there. You look up John the Prespyter, they say he was an obscure figure of the early church who was either distinguished from or identified with the Apostle John and or John of Patmos, the Revelator, the guy who wrote the book of John and the epistles of John. But they were all going to go find John, and they called themselves the Knights of St. John. So evidently, they already knew, and tradition had said, that John left with Mary and the rest, and they went to America. But nobody knows when or how or what 7 cities of gold or temple of New Jerusalem that they had built. But it was hundreds of years later that they finally started coming over. And what did they find? Oh, look at this Chicago. Oh, Liberty Cap. Oh, Tartarian buildings and massive, Athenian-style architecture. And then just burned it all down. Interesting. Now, not all of them went there. There were still stragglers. There were still people in Scotland. There were still people in France. It just was being driven out in waves. But when somebody finally decided to come over and infiltrate America and erase all of that, hundreds of years apiece, under the Prespyter St. John, then they started announcing it and making it public, and they started this little Project Paperclip thing, pre-Paperclip. But there was this mass immigration movement that were of this particular group that we always talk about, that ended up there in Brooklyn and York, and the York Rite that was brought over, and they burned down all these cities. This is why we hear in the late 19th century, they burned everything down. In the early 20th century, it was all gone. In the great world fairs. There's a lot of interesting information that I'd like to go into here in the video soon, coming up. Going deep into how this could have transpired, whereby the people that knew about the New World that had been here, I mean, it's only in legends now. You get these little legends, but it's like, oh, they had a little legend. They were coming to see the Prespyter John. Oh, and they found the 7 cities of gold, but, nobody ever found it. They just gave up and went home. But nobody knows why Coronado or any of these people were coming over. Like, they just discovered it, that there were people here, and why were their big cities look like Athens, Greece, and Chicago? So we've got to do a whole video on that one day. But let me start this number 2 by going into some more information where we left off about Charles Russell and his part of this puzzle, being an immigrant himself from these people that they were bringing over from Europe. Where were they coming from? Why were they all of a sudden finding out, oh, there's an America, let's go over there? Because they were being driven out of France and Spain. Some went to the Ottoman Empire, as we said. This is why they had World War II and a big war and a mass, genocide in that area. That's why they had to go and keep America secret for quite a few years. They managed to keep it kind of secret, because it was a big deal to get on a boat and have a whole fleet of ships come over, and then you've got to infiltrate their governments. They've already built cities. So just before they got here, all of our people got together and made a constitution of liberty and justice and freedom for all, knowing this would be the last battleground. But they and their ancestors had been here for hundreds of years. They'd been driving them out in waves. And they were the Knights of St. John. They infiltrated some of them that were still over there in Europe and created another society based on their society. You know how I know that? I mean, not to mention a lot of reasons, but probably one of the most glaring, and a way I could explain it to you so that you would see this, is look at that Knights Templar symbol on the Watchtower. As we said yesterday, the symbolism in the upper right-hand corner is a knight, and that is the Knights Templar symbolism, an emblem from the Knights Templars. They were Knights Templars who were financing this work of this Watchtower. Not to mention the Watchtower and the lighthouse being another symbol or esoteric part of this. And the phoenix bird and everything else that was on their literature. But take a look at the cross and the crown on the left top corner. Because that cross and crown is, go look it up, it's a Templar symbol. But notice the wreath, the laurel wreath that is around in a circle encompassing the crown and cross. So the cross is obviously a symbol of Jesus and his authority, that crown. Why would they use that symbol if they don't like Jesus? Well, they've surrounded it with a laurel wreath, just the way they surrounded the liberty on the statue in Chicago. The statue is holding up this plaque with the words liberty written on it. But when they burnt that down and rebuilt a mock statue of it, everything was identical except around that liberty plaque was a laurel wreath. Oh, and by the way, you say, well, wait a minute now. These guys don't like Jesus? So why do they say heralding Christ's presence? Because they're Old Testament believers and they believe in a Christ, a Messiah. It's the Antichrist, friends. He's not divine. They know that. And that's why they don't say the herald of Jesus Christ's presence, if you know what I mean. Isn't it interesting that every one of these satanic cults and modern false prophets that want you to believe that Jesus isn't coming, Jesus is in your heart, friends, and they don't never say Jesus. It's always Christ. Christ is in your heart. Christ in you. They believe in the Christ. Oh, they always believe in the Christ. That's just a Greek way of saying their Messiah. Well, they believe in their Messiah that's going to make a new world government and everyone will get down and worship it. They just don't like Jesus, friends. What they do with the laurel wreath is they say, we have infiltrated the Knights of St. John. We have infiltrated the Constitution and the government of Christ. It no longer has any authority. Your liberty is surrounded in our victory. Your Christ has been overcome by us. We have gained victory over them, and they are so proud of their victory over Jesus to infiltrate these great institutions that were done by the Knights of St. John, libraries and constitutions, freedom and justice for all, but they infiltrated it. And so the Knights Templars are obviously saying we are the infiltration of the true Church of Christ and the kingdom of Christ on earth. That is proof. Why do you think Charles Russell was dressed in a Roman toga? The Romans had this group that Josephus was involved in, the Flavians. Flavius Josephus joined the family of the Flavians, or the Flavian Caesars. And the word Flavius means the bloodline of the blonde, blue-eyed republic. And they also are the ones who started the salute. And so this is why Nazi Germany called themselves the Third Reich. So the Flavius Caesars were not related to the Julius Caesar. They were a different group. And it is kind of interesting that it was these Flavians, Titus Vespasian, and Josephus that wrote down the history, so that's all we know, right? But they're the ones that destroyed the temple at Jerusalem and murdered Jesus Christ with the direction of these Judeans. And then, so they were so keen to do whatever these Judeans were saying when Jesus died around, maybe 28 AD, maybe 29, 30 AD. 40 years later, they destroyed the Jewish temple. Whereas 40 years before that, in the days of Christ, they seemed to be unified with these Judeans and willing to kill Christ. And from that point forward, you have these Flavians and people that were like Nero and stuff that was burning everything down. They even burned Rome down. And they were these blonde, blue-eyed individuals with the salute. And they were the ones that would talk about the victory. They accommodated that symbol of the laurel wreath around anything that they conquered from that point forward. They would put it on coins because they had victory over the money. But mostly they would put it on flags of authority. They would have their laurel wreath. They had victory over that flag or that emblem, or, bond paper. It always has the laurel wreath all the way around it because you're a bondservant. They have victory over you. So everything that was signed with that laurel wreath around it meant that you were signing your life away. You were a slave. They were going to take control of you. And so the greatest symbol of that is putting the laurel wreath around your money or your flag or your seals of government, your symbols of power, your symbols of hope, a plaque of liberty. You put the laurel wreath around it. Or the symbol of the cross and the crown, which is the kingdom of Christ. They have their laurel wreath around it. They have taken it over. That's what that means. If you want more evidence, think about this peace sign that we had over the last, in the 70s and 60s. They were flashing the peace sign. Where did that get started? It's nothing to do with peace. It's a V. You're holding up a V. Now, who do you know that held up the V? Well, it started with the Romans to gain victory over their minions. Whenever they would conquer a nation or a people, or they would have victory in battle, they would hold up the victory sign. And then they would take their symbols and flags and put the laurel wreath around it. But victory, the laurel wreath is victory, and the sign of victory on your hand is the two fingers pointed up. You see it on the Baphomet symbol. He's pointing down and he's got two fingers pointing up. That's the victory symbol. And it's literally the astrological bestial nature, or these animalistic beast signs, that they're gaining victory over your Christ consciousness with government. It's victory and the laurel wreath of victory around your soul. So they had the kids go out with the rock and roll and throw up the devil sign with the horns, the bull sign, and the victory sign. The kids didn't even realize it, but they were laughing and doing chemicals that were messing up their mind. And these elite were laughing all the way and saying, look at, they're throwing up these occult signs they don't know anything about. We've conquered them. They've been conquered by Satan. They're dressing up like Satan. They've got tattoos all over the body and dark gothic hair because we're the Goths. And so Winston Churchill and Roosevelt, Nixon, they all threw up the victory signs. And this happened after World War II a lot. They were throwing up the sign because they were like, we got victory over the Gentiles. We've taken them over. We've got their country, their constitution, their flags surrounded by our laurel wreath. And we did it by means of this temple that we built by the Templars. And our sign for them is the cross and crown with the laurel wreath. We've conquered Christ. They've infiltrated it. So when they came to America, they brought the banks. When they brought the banks to America, they were ready to finance their war against us, the mental mind games. Then they made America known to everyone. They said, oh, we just discovered it. And then they started bringing these other immigrants to Brooklyn to start with. And they made an empire. And John Jacob Astor of this family created this Empire State Building and the Waldorf building that John Jacob Astor's son built. It was kind of like some crazy pyramid thing that they put Tesla up in there, and he ran the whole thing. He produced the electricity for that whole building, and it was some kind of scientific experiment in free energy until he died. And then they gave those papers what he learned in the Waldorf Astor building. They took those papers from Tesla. Remember, they didn't take it until he died. But when he died, they didn't steal it. They just took it for safekeeping so that their enemies wouldn't get it. And they handed it to somebody they could trust, John Trump. John Trump was working in the CIA. They had already been using the CIA for mind control, and they were trying to find a way to create some weapon against society. It wasn't to fight the Russians. The KGB, the CIA, and the SIS, and all of these clandestine organizations were all working together. Even now, they've got the space station up there that's being run by Russians and Americans, and the Chinese are all working together. We're all making each other's parts in the computers, and it's all one big round table that runs all the countries by means of this temple in London, which is the Bar Association, runs the whole world. And then the banking, which was created also by the Templars, because they started charging people to keep them safe on their way to pilgrimages to Jerusalem, or whatever. So they ended up collecting all this wealth. They also started the hospitals, which then they became known as hospitalers. And this is another way they could rob people, by charging them to make them well and medicines. And this turned into some, modern Orwellian MK mind control, from the finances, the hospitals, and the court system. So everybody was being rounded up and thrown into dungeons and tortured underground, and nobody said a word, because the ones that were outside of the system were already getting their little degree in the 33 degrees. One of them, they'd get the first, second, 10 degrees just to make them bound by oath to these organizations, and they couldn't tell anybody. And people were in top positions, people who were given real deep secrets about how they were mass murdering people and what the wars were all about, and the financial manipulations upon, the pedophilia and all this stuff that's going on. They would lure them in and then get them to do acts of evil and have documentation on it, and threaten to show the public, and they could never leave. They'd kill their family, or they'd be murdered, because they had taken oaths. They couldn't do any of this to people unless they took an oath, because Satan has no authority or power over any of us unless you take an oath. So if you're not a Jehovah's Witness, see, the only reason that I was shunned and they ruined my life, because I ended up at 18, stupid me, didn't realize it, and I took, I said yes to Jehovah's Witnesses. I wish I had never done that, but at the moment, I was just a kid, and they'd already started taking my family out, and I didn't know what to do. I'd been raised in it my whole life. I was brainwashed. But they had no authority over me until I went into that little room, in that secret room, and said yes to their agreement. It was all recorded. But that gave them the right, legally, because I agreed to it. And they told me that they could get rid of me if I didn't do what they said, but I didn't think they were serious. And think about it. I didn't sign any oath or join any secret handshake signs or anything. I didn't know. So I don't think that in the Lord's eyes, I'm innocent. But had I become a Mormon or a Mason and I had taken an oath in any of their degrees, then they have the right to literally murder you in brutal and terrible ways. So this is why they can take these people to prison. You say, well, they did something wrong, they went to prison. Well, no, they're usually probably already involved in the mafia. They were murdering people, now they get murdered. If you're not a murderer, then nobody's going to murder you. You see somebody at the gas station, he's just minding his own business, right? Putting gas in. Somebody comes along and a car stops and machine guns come out, and they just shoot them all up. Oh, tragic. This just happens to innocent people. No, that guy was a drug dealer or something. You make deals with these cartels and religions. Even when you buy a house, you sign on a bond paper. Now you're in debt to them, and they can take your life, your family, anytime they want. Whatever agreement you signed, that's the agreement you got. You get a driver's license, now they can arrest you when you go down the highway. You don't want to be a part of their world? Don't get a driver's license and don't even drive on their roads. Well, I can't live like that. Listen, you got to live in the real world or you can't be alive. So there's so much that went on. It took so long for them to infiltrate and murder the seed of Christ and Christianity and put that laurel wreath around it. And it's around our flag. It's around our Constitution here. But what led up to this? Well, one of the first things that started was, along with Tesla and that Waldorf building and all their machinations and goings on, there was a man named Charles Taze Russell. We've also talked about Brigham Young and what he did, and murdering the prophet, and going out to Salt Lake and creating a big Gothic temple, and all the secret societies that's running the underground UFO cities under Salt Lake City, under Thule, and different Area 51s and the FBI, and it's run by Mormons. But out east in Brooklyn, this little group of immigrants were planning on building Hollywood, and Charles Russell was bringing these individuals to Hollywood just before he died. And it was then taken over by Rutherford, the second president of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. They were the first people, their members were the first people to finance the motion picture industry, the record industry, the phonograph. And so this was the foundation for the rock and roll and the satanic music, the satanic church. So it was Charles Russell that brought these immigrants over. And in that little bunch was Aleister Crowley and Anton LaVey that started the satanic church and rock and roll and the music in the Hollywood and the porn industry and all of this evil that's going on. So I want to show you the information about how all this started. And there's various doors that we could open and go through to see another aspect of this. But today I want to show you where it started here with Charles Taze Russell and the Watchtower organization. So Charles Russell founds the Bible Students Association, International Bible Students Association, in 1870. And he formed a group called the Bible Students. And then not very long after that, he came up with this Zion's Watchtower Bible and Tract Society name. But most of these other names they were still incorporated and used for laundering money and stuff. Most people nowadays, Jehovah's Witnesses, will go back and they'll say, oh, they were Bible students. And all we've ever heard is Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. We don't realize that there was international associations and different that and the other different kinds of groups. Many different names for these groups. So, at that point, Charles Russell says to the world, I am the seventh Laodicean messenger. So he understood that each of the seven churches were, like the first church was for the early first century, and the second church, and it goes down to the seventh church, which is his day. And he would be the last messenger, or like he's the angel. So he saw himself as the final successor. He thought of himself like, an apostle, or somebody like Wycliffe who translated the Bible, or even Waldo. He knew about Waldo and studied, that history. He liked Luther. He thought of himself as something like that. And then he goes and he starts preaching that the world was going to end, and this would all happen in 1914 based on the pyramids, based on the fact that he was the man with the writer's inkhorn in the book of Ezekiel, and the man who hath wisdom in the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation, who would count the number of the beast. And so, with his little ink pen, the man with the writer's inkhorn and his white robe, he was a priest, and that's why he died in the Roman toga. He began to preach that the world would fall and crumble, and that, politics, commerce, and religion were the three big foundation stones of Babylon, and that they would begin to crumble beginning in 1874 and the full end of the world would have happened in 1914. When none of that happened after 1914, they just switched it and started the 1874 thing when the world would start to crumble, that last generation, and they moved that up to 1914. And then the 1914 was moved up to different dates many times, like 1930 something and 1945 or something with the Second World War. And then they had the date of somewhere in the 1975, the world was going to come to an end, and then it was something else, and it just keeps going. Now I think they just don't want to talk about it because they proclaimed for so many years that the people that were living in 1914 would never die. And now, in order to be still alive, if you were, because they told everybody you had to be at least 20 years old in 1914. So that's 110 plus 20, that's 130 years old, nobody's alive. And they were specifically saying that their governing body, somebody had to still be alive. And all of their governing body from that age died. So they just keep moving the dates up. So he started calling himself Pastor Russell. And then he started saying, yeah, I believe in Christ. Because remember, he was a Gnostic or an agnostic. Well, see, he never said, oh, but now I believe in Jesus. He said, oh, there was some guy named Jesus, but he's not the divine being. But he does believe in Christ. Well, that's the whole point of Zionism. They're waiting for their Jewish Messiah. And so then he starts on this thing with Jehovah because, he was going back to the Old Testament. And he joins the Masons, which, at a young age in his family, they knew that their whole premise, their whole constitution and purpose for life was to destroy the Knights of St. John or the true teachings of Christ. And they did it because no Christian today, no denomination, none of them has any idea about St. John and Jesus and the Languedoc and all the things that was, where they were. And they're like, most Christians say, oh, that's terrible. We don't believe in that. We're Christians. We don't believe in government and people's lineal descendants and so. Okay, well then, who's going to protect, if you don't knight somebody to protect it, who's going to protect for 2,000 years the holy Textus Receptus? Well, it was preserved. It's just that now they've convinced you it doesn't really exist and you never read it. You just read the Masoretic version, right? Which is the lie. But the true Christians would never read that. I mean, they might have read it. It's not like some taboo, but they didn't believe in it, that translation. They believed in only the Septuagint, the accurate translation, with all the Apocrypha. And in fact, they believed in every scripture on the face of the earth. They were originally from Alexandria and the library, and they believed in all of these things, and they were all brothers, Pliny and Plutarch together. They were all priests. And so was Ovid, priests. And these priests were priests of temples that were either Judean, because Judah had more than one temple. It wasn't just in that one spot down there in Palestine today. There's the one there at Heliopolis and the other at Elephantine, and they had others. There was no set place where they thought the actual temple was, except they knew where it really originally was, which was at Heliopolis. And Josephus says that they did build the temple back there at Heliopolis, which is the grand city of the sun, Ra, Ur, Salem. And it is also called Bethel. It's like 2 miles from there is Bethel. And this was the hub of the continental center of all geographical locations on earth. And around about that was the entire world, from Africa, China, around to Russia, Europe, Alaska, United States, Mexico, South America, Antarctica, Australia, and back up around through New Zealand and Taiwan and Japan and back around. That was the circuit called Galilee. And Jesus preached on the circuit to each and every tribe before he died. And then saw them again after his resurrection in the spirit. In Europe, he went to Paul with his spiritual eternal body that was made of light. And he met with all these individuals that were all around the world in every tribe, probably more than 12. He met to every nation that there was and told them that he would come again and that they should love one another. And he gave them the sermon like he did there in the Bible, the Sermon on the Mount. So he believed in these dates partly because he would measure the Egyptian pyramid and he would look at astrological data, and he predicted that in 1874 the world would begin to crumble. That would be the last generation. And he said that the Great Pyramid revealed that Jehovah lived on a star called Alcyon in the Pleiades. So this goes along, and then it didn't happen, not on schedule anyway. So he decides, well, we'll move the date up. But while he was alive, he declared to the world in magazines and pamphlets, millions of tracts all over the world. And literally, in his lifetime and the church that came from him, Jehovah's Witnesses thereafter, in all these years, they have probably literally single-handedly changed the world. Well, I don't know about single-handedly, because I think Adventists were doing a little of that too. It's funny how the Adventists took the Sabbath issue and Jehovah's Witnesses took the name of Jehovah issue. And if you put them both together, they'd just be actual Jews. They were both originally Zionists. So then he declares that the Trinity is idolatry, that if you worship Christ, that's idolatry, that Christ was not God, but the Archangel Michael incarnate, and that he died on a stake, not a cross. And when he died, it didn't redeem you from your sins. It wasn't redemptive, or it didn't pay the ransom. And that the idea that we have an immortal soul is a pagan doctrine. And so when you die, you're gone. You're extinct. He believed in science more than he believed in the declarations of Scripture. He was very into science. In fact, today, last I looked, Jehovah's Witnesses in their Awake magazine have these news articles at the back and scientific experiments. They're telling people to go get the thingy, right? They're even offering the thingy in the congregations and having the elders coerce the members to get the thingy. They cooperated completely with the government in this last episode that we had. But basically he was preaching this great judgment, or what he called Armageddon, which would be the great last war. And I think they've gone back and forth from believing that there would be a great tribulation of 3.5 years and then the Armageddon. Now I don't even think they believe there's coming a great tribulation. It's like basically just Armageddon's coming, because they've already gone through the tribulation back in 1914 or something. I don't know what they believe. It's ridiculous. They change it every few weeks. But he believed that anyone who was judged unworthy of life or condemned by the new millennial kingdom would be completely annihilated, and only the righteous would exist after Christ returns. So he preaches against the Christianity that everybody had known for a long time. And it would be one thing if he was getting rid of things that Christians were doing wrong and then replacing it with the truth. But none of the things that he taught them was actually the truth. He didn't teach that the divine being was within us, the kingdom was within us, that we would establish the kingdom when we were awakened to love. But they gravitated right back to going to the principles of the law, disfellowshipping, and all of this. Now, I don't know how much that was going on originally when Charles Taze Russell was alive, but that's what it degenerated into. But this guy promoted Zionism, and like I say, pretty much Judaism with you're saying you got to worship Jehovah now. Because the original Cathar Baptist movement, Christians that were here in America, they understood that Jehovah was the devil. But even when I was a kid going from door to door, I'd knock on people's door and you'd say Jehovah, and they'd never heard of it. They thought it was the devil. And some of them said, no, their church taught them that that is the devil. And I think a lot of Baptists did teach that Jehovah was the devil about 150 years ago or 100 years ago. But after Charles Taze Russell came along and plastered his pamphlets all over the world, he's gotten the whole world to believe. It's just like this Watchtower Bible and Tract Society Bible called the New World Order Bible. New World Order. And they keep talking about the New World Order that's coming. Yeah, they keep talking about now they're telling people when the FEMA camps come, go to the FEMA camp, sell your house and give it to them. All the money and the proceeds, and then get in the FEMA camp. They're telling them this. They're telling them that they should just sell their homes because we're all going to go into FEMA camps. Most Jehovah's Witnesses have no idea, but Charles Russell wasn't just some little pastor, right? At the time, his name was known all over the world. He was this kind of like Joel Osteen or whatever. Everybody knew about him. And he was putting the fires out in hell, and he was teaching people that Jesus wasn't the Lord, and we got to go back to Judaism and call him Jehovah. But he was running around doing these world tours, like some Bon Jovi or something, and he would kind of like Trump, with the crowd. He would have these crowds of people. It was always about getting crowds of people together. And he'd have these little people working for him with a phonograph, trying to, not to get them to join a religion, but to get them to come to listen to him. It was a political message, Zionism. And he went all over the world. And he was promoted by his Freemasonic friends and finance. That's why he gave him the building. Like as I said, the greatest port, the biggest port in the world, across from the UN building. So he toured the globe. He lectured millions of people. He taught people you didn't have to become a Christian to get saved. In fact, Christ didn't come to save the world. He taught that. But he said that Christ came to save one little group of people. And he was not the savior of all men, just a small group of people. Christianity was idolatry. And he taught that Jewish people should never convert to Christianity because Jews were already saved because they were Jews, because of their heritage, because they were the chosen people. And he was very Zionist. And he did not tell them, he did not preach that Jews should become Christians. So basically, you don't have to be a Christian to be saved, but you could be a Jew or a true Christian which just followed the Jews and was like converting to Judaism. So even to this day, Jehovah's Witnesses do not believe that Jesus died for everybody's sins. Most Jehovah's Witnesses have never really told this. And almost nobody ever goes to their door or when they come to your door and points this out. But it's a fact. I mean, it's so glaringly there. It's in all their watchtowers that only a small group of individuals will have eternal life and salvation and will become immortal. There is no hope of immortality for a Gentile or for the peasants or people who aren't the chosen ones, whatever that might be. The elect. If you're not part of the elect, which is a small group of individuals who are going to have immortality, but if you're one of the nations, the dogs, he never promised you eternal life. You can stay in this world. If you die, you don't exist no more. That's it. You're annihilated. But you can continue to live in this one life that they claim you'll get to live for maybe 1,000 years. He'll give you some miraculous ability to live maybe 900,000 years. But during that time, if you ever get on his bad side, or you do something wrong, or you drink a little too much, or you get your sideburns too long, or you're not in uniform, or you say the wrong words, you start doubting, or anything that you might do, you will lose your life and go to eternal extinction. And in the end, because you're all mortals and imperfect, because you're never going to become perfect, you'll all make mistakes along the way, and eventually you'll all be gone. Basically, he thinks those individuals he taught were only wood choppers and water carriers for the elect, meaning that they were slaves and they would only have a temporary life. And with this, he converted the world? Not really. But he converted a lot of his own ilk and friends, and they became the upper echelon of the society. And later on, when Nor comes along, he softened the message and advertised it to the Gentiles, and they didn't accentuate those parts. But they made it sound wonderful that you'd get to live for 1,000 years in a paradise. Wow, maybe if you're really good. You could live 900 years as a woodchopper or a water carrier for the elect. You could be a slave. But the way they worded it, it sounded wonderful, because you'd live in a paradise and you'd have a nice house. They'd give you a little, I don't know, guest house on the one of the elect's ranches, and you could feed their sheep and pick their fruit and stuff for them. So he was basically going all over the world with these big conventions, trying to advertise and get these little peasants to be like little slaves and peddle the magazines for free, because it was advertising to get a certain number of the elect in the organization before the world collapsed. And I think it's kind of happening kind of the way he thought it would. They had this all planned. They're going to kind of collapse the system, which it has been kind of collapsing since the World War I. So it was really not the Christian church. It had nothing to do with that, but it was a Masonic organization that was trying to gather the elect into one little organization, and that only they would have this amazing truth, and they would rule the world for 1,000 years. It was really a organization that was gathering the elite chosen elect who were then going to rule the world. He had a wife named Maria Ackley, and she got a divorce from him. And in the divorce war, she revealed to the world, with public proof and everything, his adulteries several times, that he had been a child molester. Look, I don't know if he really was, but this was what was accused of him. And usually when these big, powerful men that get skyscrapers on Brooklyn ports, financed by the Rothschilds, promoting Zionism, an immigrant in Brooklyn, usually when they do these kinds of things, and it's rumored they really did. So it seems like he might have been a womanizer, a child molester. He embezzled millions and millions of dollars. They claim he was a fraud, and he committed all kinds of crimes. 1916, he died. So if you think about what he's teaching, it escapes most people. He believed that the Judeans didn't have to be Christians. They were saved by being born a Judean. They were going to be saved. Now, yeah, Jehovah's Witnesses today have this whole 144,000 thing. But that's not exactly the way Russell had it. Because certainly or surely he would have understood that the 144,000 in his day, he must have thought of them as the ones who were chosen, or the Judeans. And they didn't have to be Christians. And they were going to be immortal and rule the world. And they were going to take with them this little group that were, maybe they weren't the elect, but they could come along because they needed workers. So it was going to be basically a one world government with Jews and Jehovah's Witnesses at the top. That's what it was going to be. It was a group for collecting a number of individuals to facilitate the bringing forth of Zion. Now, if this was a organization that nobody cared about and somebody could wrestle from somebody else in a court of law, well, yeah, but the court of law is run by the same people, the same Freemasons. So they gave the organization to Rutherford. They said it was a lawsuit, but there was no way anybody else was ever going to win, because they'd already chosen Rutherford, who was also a Freemason, a judge, to take over. And immediately, Judge Rutherford, who was already instructed by Russell before he had his ritualistic Roman toga death on a train near a graveyard on October the 31st, Halloween night, coming back from his gold mine in California and from getting finances to found Hollywood. He instructed Judge Rutherford to go to Europe and start bringing over, in a pre-project paperclip, these Bavarians. He brought them over, this group, the elite that we were talking about, the JWs and the other elite group, the Orthodox. And they would bring them over in a kind of a project paperclip. These are the ones that started Hollywood. The first 3 motion picture companies were all financed and run by Jehovah's Witnesses. The phonograph companies and the record companies and all of this was run by Jehovah's Witnesses, which were staffed by these Bavarians brought over in a pre-paperclip scenario. And of the individuals that came over to Hollywood was one named Aleister Crowley, who started a major secret society in Pasadena, California, which is where Jack Parsons was taught, who created the space agency, which is where Anton LaVey created the Satanic Church. And I don't know if this connection is just some kind of coincidence, but it's interesting that another group that was financed, they had him on television, Herbert W. Armstrong, also trying to get people back to the law of Moses, set up a Bible missionary college or something in Pasadena, California, the same spot that all these other guys are creating satanic churches and so forth. I know. And remember, it was Russell who brought these guys over. And L. Ron Hubbard and other individuals that started the CIA and so forth. Remember, they were also, Russell's brothers and his family were also organizing the Mormons and other groups. So they had their hand in all of these organized. They didn't care what organization it was or what they believed. It was all about what would deceive the people the most. They didn't care about what was true. They would change their doctrines to suit what the propaganda would be. And so Jehovah's Witnesses changed their doctrines about every few years. They completely revamped their propaganda for various political reasons. And they get involved in a lot of political things like policies, you know. They say you can't have a beard or whatever. You got to be clean shaven because it's like the army. You have to wear the uniform, a black coat and a white shirt. You're a ministerial servant. You are a priest. But unlike you, the governing body were all, every one of them here in America. Well, of course, you would have to say, well, they were in Brooklyn. There are a lot of immigrants over there. But they seem to all be these immigrants that were becoming the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society leaders. Because after Russell was Knorr with a K, Knorr, and then Franz, right? Franz, German word. Milton Hinchel, you know? And now the guy who runs the place is a guy named Don Adams. Remember the movie star Adams? I mean, Adam goes back to the first man, and in what language do we call him Adam? Hebrew. So, what has come of Jehovah's Witnesses? Well, they become false prophets. They're more and more trying to gain mesmerism and hypnotistic kind of control over their people. They won't allow them to go anywhere, do anything, go to be worldly, as they say. They have their own get-togethers and fun. But the funny thing is they allow them to drink as much as they want, basically, unless it's a political reason they want to get rid of you. You can drink as much as you want. And they have these little get-togethers and parties. And some of the, you know, a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses don't know it, but in these congregations in the big cities where the bigwigs live, there is a lot of favoritism. The people in the congregation there are wealthy. They have their little private get-togethers. And they even, some of them swapping wives. There's been a lot of that going along with Jehovah's Witnesses. They will have these elite parties and swap wives, and it stays within the elder arrangement. Because they know, these are people at the top, that this is a fake religion. They've got to that point where they realize that they're just pretending and keeping these peasants down. So as they grew, they became so ironclad of a group that you could hide somebody in it, because it was like a world in the world without the world, right? It was like another society within a society. And it was all secret, and you couldn't be a part of the rest of the world. You had to take an oath to join. And if you broke your oath, you were shunned and you would never be spoken to again. Friends, I know this to be true because my Jehovah's Witness family hasn't spoken to me in, 40 or 50 years. I haven't heard from my father in 30 years. And so what kind of an organization could do that kind of thing? Well, it's kind of like, how do they keep these UFO kind of ships that the government's making and these Nazi orbs and all this stuff? How do they keep that secret? Well, it's all being managed, and the only people that know about it are Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, or certain Masons that are under a vow or an oath. And once you put yourself under an oath, they can kill you. They have the right. You have to understand, they have no authority over anyone on this earth. You go and you get a license with the DMV, and now you are responsible to do and act the way they say so on the highway because you signed it. You get married, that's not love. You now are a ward of the state and all of your children thereafter, and you must sign your name at the bottom of their birth certificate, which is bond paper, meaning you're a bond servant. And that bond, that contract, puts you under bondage. It is slavery, and the paper is surrounded by a laurel wreath, just as your money or anything else, and it's a binding contract. And Jehovah's Witnesses are at the top of wanting you to cooperate. Most Jehovah's Witnesses will immediately go to the doctor after every sniffle and take all their medications, and that night probably have a party and drink a bunch of alcohol as well. So, because of this way this organization is, because it's so secret and it's so powerful, they can harbor people. And this is why there's so many pedophiles in Jehovah's Witnesses. They have a little rule that you got to have 2 or 3 witnesses and they won't budge. So if a little girl is raped by an old man in a room and nobody sees it, and the only testimony we have is the little girl, then that elder, they're not allowed to say or reveal to the public that he had been accused of this. But you see, they make this sound like it's a big perplexing paradox. We don't know what to do. The Bible says you've got to have 2 or 3 witnesses. Well, that's why in court they use bloody gloves and DNA and so forth. Now, I don't know whether I'm all in on the DNA because I don't believe in DNA, but there is precedence even under the law of Moses, which, by the way, we're not even under the law of Moses. But common sense says the little girl can be taken to a doctor or someone who has the expertise, and they can decide whether she has been raped. There is certainly more ways to get testimony than just the guy's admission, but they simply are trying to keep it under the rug. They don't take it to the authorities, which, some of you might think, well, I can understand that because I don't like the authorities. But they're very cooperative with the authorities in so many cases. It's only in strange circumstances that they buck the system, and I'll tell you what I mean. I think it's the system itself trying to change the system. They are kind of like the ACLU in a lot of ways. So then he goes and he molests other people's children in the congregation. And most of the other Jehovah's Witnesses maybe are not pedophiles. They have no idea what's going on there, and they can't believe it. The guy keeps getting away with it. So they're harboring these individuals because I believe they're it's almost like a government safe house for criminals. And so there was all these scandals about they wouldn't take blood transfusions and they wouldn't stop the pedophilia. Well, why do they insist upon you must never take blood? Well, you see, every secret society organization requires you to take a crazy, ridiculous, I would say it's an initiation ploy. It's a test to see if you'll obey. A step in faith. Not in faith that you believe in the Lord, but a step of blind faith that you declare you believe and will do anything they say. See, in order to join our organization, you have to agree that if you go to the doctor and you're about to die, you have to agree to die. Because most operations, they give blood transfusions. So you're really basically saying, if I ever go to the doctor, I'm going to have to let my life go. And I got to give my life on the altar. It's blood sacrifice, friends. That's what it is. They believe that blood is sacred. And if you are dying, they require your blood to be poured out onto the ground. And that blood is a atonement for your sins. So yes, Jehovah's Witnesses not only carry out a black mass, and they have been doing this probably, I don't know when this started, they perform the black mass every year at Passover time. They all get together and they pass around the body and blood of Christ, and they reject it because they don't believe in Jesus, friends. But anyway, I'm going to probably just leave it there. There's so much more we could talk about, friends, but I thought you'd like to know, and maybe you could share this with one of the people that you might come across that would need to hear this. I'm going to go ahead and go. Lord will bless you. May his grace and peace be with you. We'll see you tomorrow, friends. Have a good one.